The barbed wire gleamed silver in the morning sun, stretched taut between steel posts that had appeared overnight like metallic weeds. Maria Santos pressed her weathered palm against the cold metal, feeling the sharp edges bite gently into her skin. On the other side of the fence, barely 3 feet away, her neighbor Harold Whitman was doing the same thing, his face a mask of barely contained fury. 27 years, Maria whispered, her voice carrying across the narrow divide. 27 years we've walked this path to the river. Harold's jaw worked silently. Behind him, his pristine suburban development sprawled across what had once been rolling farmland, each house a monument to progress and prosperity. Behind Maria, the modest homes of Riverside community sat clustered together like old friends, sharing secrets, their gardens spilling over with vegetables and wildflowers that had grown without permission or planning. The fence had gone up on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the lawyers had arrived. "It's perfectly legal," insisted Bradley Morrison, adjusting his silk tie as he stood in the community center that served as Riverside's unofficial town hall. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the worn linoleum as he paced before the assembled residents. "The Whitman Hills Homeowners Association has every right to secure their property boundaries. The path you've been using crosses private land." Private land that was a public easement for over a century, shot back Carlos Mendoza, Maria's son-in-law, and the closest thing Riverside had to a lawyer. His voice carried the weight of someone who had learned the language of legal battles the hard way. "Our families have used that path since before your client's development was even a dream in some banker's head." Morrison's smile was cold as winter rain. "Dreams backed by proper documentation, Mr. Mendoza. Unlike your traditional arrangements." The room erupted. Voices in English and Spanish blended together in a symphony of outrage that had been building for months. The fence was just the latest insult in a long series of encroachments. First, the developers had restricted access to the parking area near the riverbank. Then they'd installed security cameras that seemed to watch the Riverside residents with mechanical suspicion. Now this, a physical barrier that cut them off from the Rio Grande, the lifeblood that had sustained their community for generations. Maria stood slowly, her arthritis protesting the movement. At 73, she had survived the transition from rural ranch land to suburban sprawl, had watched her children grow up swimming in the river that now lay behind enemy wire. The room fell quiet as she spoke. "You think you can fence us out?" Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of decades spent fighting for her community. "You think a little wire changes who we are, what this place means?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Santos, I understand your attachment to tradition, but progress requires..." "Progress." Maria's laugh was sharp as the barbed wire itself. "You call cutting people off from their heritage progress. You call dividing neighbors progress." She walked to the window, gesturing toward the fence that now bisected the landscape like a scar. "That wire won't keep us out, Mr. Morrison, but it might just keep something else in." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy with the promise of the monsoon season that would arrive in just 2 weeks. The Rio Grande, swollen with mountain snowmelt, whispered its ancient secrets to anyone still willing to listen. None of them could have predicted that nature itself was about to choose sides. 2 weeks after the lawyers left, the sky cracked open like a broken dam. Maria Santos stood at her kitchen window, watching sheets of rain hammer against the earth with biblical fury. The monsoon had arrived 3 days early, and with a vengeance that made the old-timers shake their heads and mutter prayers. In 48 hours, more water had fallen than in the previous 6 months combined. "Abuela," the river, her granddaughter Sophia called from the back door, her voice tight with worry. "You need to see this." Maria grabbed her rain slicker and followed Sophia into the deluge. The path to the riverbank, the same path that had caused so much trouble, was now a rushing stream itself. Where once the Rio Grande had meandered peacefully between its banks, it now rolled like a wild animal, dark water churning with debris from upstream, tree branches, pieces of fencing, someone's patio furniture spinning like toys in a bathtub. Dios mío, Maria breathed, crossing herself. The water had already consumed the lower pastures and was creeping steadily toward both communities. On the other side of the infamous fence, Harold Whitman was having his own moment of reckoning. His perfectly manicured lawn was now a shallow lake, and water was seeping into his basement, despite the expensive French drains the developers had promised would handle any weather emergency. His neighbors were in full panic mode, loading SUVs with photo albums and electronics, their faces pale with the realization that their flood insurance might not cover an act of God of this magnitude. The pump station's failing, called out Tom Peterson, Harold's next-door neighbor and fellow homeowners association board member. He was ankle-deep in muddy water, shouting over the rain. The whole drainage system's backing up. Harold stared at the rising water with growing horror. The developers had assured them that their elevated position and modern infrastructure would protect them from any flooding. What they hadn't counted on was the river changing course, or the fact that all their carefully planned drainage led directly into what was now a raging torrent. Meanwhile, on the Riverside community's side, something remarkable was happening. Instead of panic, there was purpose. Carlos Mendoza had spent the morning coordinating with county emergency services, his legal training proving useful in cutting through bureaucratic red tape. The community center had been transformed into a coordination hub, with residents organizing evacuation routes and supply distribution with the efficiency of people who had weathered storms before. The sandbags need to go along the eastern perimeter first, Maria directed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through 3 major floods. The water always comes from that direction when the river jumps its banks. But even as they worked, everyone could see that this flood was different. The water wasn't just rising, it was angry, carrying the force of unprecedented rainfall from across the entire watershed. The fence that had divided their communities now stood partially submerged, its barbed wire glinting uselessly beneath the surface. By evening, the extent of the crisis became clear. The Whitman Hills development, with its impermeable concrete and asphalt surfaces, had created a funnel effect that concentrated the floodwater. Their drainage system, designed for normal rainfall, was overwhelmed. Water that should have been absorbed by natural floodplains and vegetation was instead racing toward the river with devastating force. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The community that had tried to fence out their neighbors was now trapped by their own barriers, while the community it attempted to isolate was mobilizing to help anyone who needed it. As night fell and emergency sirens wailed in the distance, Maria stood again at her window. The fence posts were now barely visible above the waterline, and she could see lights flickering desperately in the Whitman Hills houses as residents realized that all their legal victories meant nothing against the raw power of nature. Tomorrow, she knew, the real test would begin, not of property rights or legal boundaries, but of what it meant to be neighbors, when the water rose higher than any fence could reach. The emergency sirens began wailing at 3:47 a.m. on the 3rd day of rain, their mechanical screams cutting through the drumming deluge like knives through fabric. Maria Santos jolted awake to the sound of her granddaughter pounding on her bedroom door. Abuela. The dam. They're saying the upstream dam might fail. Maria's blood turned to ice water. The Riverside Dam, built in the 1940s, had been showing stress fractures for years. If it went, everything downstream would be obliterated in minutes, not hours. Within 20 minutes, both communities were in chaos, but it was a revealing kind of chaos. In Whitman Hills, residents fled in luxury vehicles loaded with valuables, their panic individual and desperate, every family for themselves, racing toward higher ground without looking back. Harold Whitman found himself standing alone in his flooded driveway, watching his neighbors abandon ship, realizing with crystal clarity that all their homeowners association meetings about community standards had built exactly zero actual community. In Riverside, something entirely different was unfolding. Carlos Mendoza had established a command center in the community hall, coordinating with emergency services, while Maria and the other elders organized evacuation priorities. Children and elderly first, then families with medical needs, then everyone else in order of proximity to the flood zone. Mrs. Chen can't walk far, called out Rosa Martinez, helping her elderly neighbor toward the evacuation buses. Her medications are still in the house. I'll get them, volunteered Miguel Santos, Maria's youngest son, already wading through knee-deep water toward the Chen house. But it was Harold Whitman's wife, Patricia, who changed everything. She had been loading photo albums into their Mercedes when she heard screaming from across the submerged fence line. Through the rain and darkness, she could see a figure trapped on the roof of a partially collapsed mobile home. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, 84 years old and diabetic, who had been too proud to evacuate with the others. Patricia Whitman had never spoken to Elena Vasquez in her life, had never even acknowledged her existence, despite living 300 yards away for 5 years. But something primal kicked in when she saw another human being in mortal danger. "Harold," she screamed over the storm. "There's someone trapped." Harold turned to see his wife already climbing over the submerged fence, her expensive clothes instantly soaked, her manicured hands gripping the barbed wire without regard for the cuts it was opening in her palms. "Patricia, no, it's too dangerous." But she was already across, wading through chest-deep water that rushed with terrifying force toward the raging river. Harold watched his wife of 23 years risk her life for a stranger, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what mattered. He followed. The rescue was chaotic and desperate. Harold, a weekend golfer who hadn't done manual labor in decades, found himself hauling elderly Elena Vasquez down from her roof with the help of Miguel Santos, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere with rope and determination. Patricia held the makeshift ladder steady while water swirled around her waist, her face grim with concentration. "The current's getting stronger," Miguel shouted. "We need to move now." They formed a human chain: Harold, Patricia, Miguel, and 2 other Riverside residents who had joined the rescue, and slowly fought their way back toward higher ground. Elena, conscious but weak, gripped Harold's shoulders with surprising strength. "Gracias," she whispered in his ear as they reached safety. "Gracias, mijo." Harold had never been called mijo, son, by anyone but his own mother. The word hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it the recognition of connection he had spent years trying to fence out. As dawn broke gray and terrible over the flooded landscape, both communities found themselves clustered together on the highest ground they could find, the parking lot of the old Riverside Elementary School. The floodwater had erased property lines, homeowners association boundaries, and legal distinctions. Rich and poor, documented and undocumented, English-speaking and Spanish-speaking, all of them were simply people whose homes were underwater. The dam held, barely, but the flood had accomplished what years of legal battles and community organizing have failed to achieve. It had torn down every barrier except the ones that actually mattered, the ones between strangers and neighbors, between fear and compassion, between the life you plan and the life that actually unfolds when the water rises higher than any fence can reach. Harold Whitman sat on a folding chair, his $1,000 shoes ruined, sharing a thermos of coffee with Maria Santos. Neither spoke, but both understood that when the water receded, they would have to decide what kind of community to rebuild from the wreckage of their assumptions. The morning after the flood brought a silence, so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. The water had receded just enough to reveal the devastation. Cars flipped upside down, mobile homes twisted off their foundations, and that infamous fence now a twisted sculpture of metal and wire, wrapped around a massive cottonwood tree like some abstract monument to human folly. Harold Whitman stood surveying the wreckage of his backyard, his expensive patio furniture scattered across 3 properties. His pool had become a repository for half the neighborhood's debris, including what appeared to be someone's entire vegetable garden. But it wasn't the property damage that kept him awake. It was the memory of Elena Vasquez calling him Mijo, and the way Miguel Santos had risked his life to help a stranger. "The insurance adjuster won't be here for a week," Patricia said, joining him at the sliding glass door. Her hands were still bandaged from the barbed wire cuts, but she wore them like badges of honor. "Tom Peterson's already talking about selling and moving to Phoenix." Harold nodded absently. Half the Whitman Hills residents were making similar noises, their faith in suburban paradise permanently shattered. But something had shifted in Harold during those terrifying hours in the floodwater. The comfortable distance he'd maintained from his neighbors, all his neighbors, suddenly felt like the most expensive luxury he'd ever indulged in. Across the demolished fence line, the Riverside community was already organizing recovery efforts with the same efficiency they'd shown during the crisis. Maria Santos had converted the community center into a coordination hub for insurance claims, temporary housing, and volunteer work crews. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the disorganized community was proving far more resilient than the planned development with its homeowners association bylaws and architectural review committees. Mrs. Santos. Harold found himself walking across the muddy boundary between properties, stepping carefully over twisted fence posts. "I wanted to thank you for everything your people did during the flood." Maria looked up from a clipboard where she was organizing work assignments. Her expression was guarded but not hostile. "Your wife saved Elena's life. We should be thanking you." "No, I mean..." Harold struggled with words that had never been necessary before. "I mean for organizing everything, for showing us how neighbors are supposed to act." The conversation might have ended there, awkward and incomplete, if 7-year-old Sofia Santos hadn't chosen that moment to come running up, clutching a waterlogged photo. "Abuela, look what I found by the river." She held up a picture of Harold and Patricia's wedding day, somehow preserved despite everything. "Is this the man who helped save Tia Elena?" Harold stared at the photo, 23 years younger, full of certainty about how life was supposed to unfold. Maria examined it with the careful attention she gave to all precious things. "Sigh, Mija. This is Mr. Harold. He and his wife were very brave." She handed the photo back to Harold. "Some things survived the flood, no." That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Harold Whitman knocked on doors throughout Riverside, not to serve legal papers or complain about property values, but to volunteer for cleanup work. He showed up with work gloves and a willingness to take direction from Carlos Mendoza, who was coordinating debris removal. "I don't know much about manual labor," Harold admitted, watching Miguel Santos expertly operate a chainsaw to clear fallen trees. "But I can learn." "Everyone can learn," Miguel replied, pausing his work. "My father, he always said the flood teaches everyone the same lesson. We're all just trying to keep our heads above water." By evening, an impromptu community barbecue had emerged in the Riverside community parking lot. Someone had salvaged a gas grill from the flood debris. Elena Vasquez was directing the preparation of enough rice and beans to feed an army, and Patricia Whitman found herself learning to make tortillas from scratch under the patient tutelage of Rosa Martinez. "You have to feel the dough," Rosa explained, guiding Patricia's inexperienced hands. "It tells you when it's ready." Harold sat at a folding table with Maria, sharing a paper plate of food unlike anything he'd ever tasted in his climate-controlled suburban existence. Around them, children played in the mud with the unself-conscious joy of kids who understood that puddles were for jumping in, not avoiding. "I need to ask you something," Harold said finally. "Before the flood, when you said the fence might keep something in rather than keeping you out, what did you mean?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, watching her granddaughter teach the Peterson children how to make paper boats. "Fear," she said simply. "When you fence out your neighbors, you fence in your fear. You make it bigger by feeding it, until it's the only thing you can see." The cleanup would take months. The insurance battles would drag on for years. Some Whitman Hills residents would never return, selling their damaged properties to developers who promised even better flood control. But sitting in that parking lot, sharing food with people whose names he was only beginning to learn, Harold Whitman understood that the flood had given him something far more valuable than property values or perfect drainage systems. It had given him back his neighbors.